Hello and welcome to PSA's Let's Squawk About It. I'm PSA's Marketing Manager, Sam Schaefer, and today we are pleased to welcome Darrin Karcher from Purdue University. Darrin, why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself, what you do in your area of expertise?
Sure, thanks, Sam. So as Sam said, I'm Darrin Karcher. I'm an associate professor and poultry extension specialist here at Purdue University. My job is to work with people that have 6 chickens in the backyard all the way up to our commercial industries here in Indiana and around the United States and world. My emphasis and focus tends to be laying hens, but I also do work with meat birds as well.
Definitely a lot of variety working from a backyard flock of 6 to a poultry producer that has thousands of birds.
Absolutely. Never a dull moment.
Yeah, no. Well, today we are discussing consumers and cage-free eggs. So, Darrin, let's start by talking about what has been going on the past decade or so with the transition to cage-free, and specifically what has sparked the push and what seems to be the biggest challenge for producers trying to accommodate this trend.
Yeah, so I'm going to take us back a little bit further than a decade, Sam. So if we look at since the 1950s, we discovered that if we went into conventional cages, which is how we produce the majority of our eggs today, we could see an increase in production. We saw better health outcomes for our birds, and overall, workers enjoyed being in the houses more than when they were on the floor. In about 2010, we started to, or 2008, 2010, we started to see this push for a transition to, I'll call them extensive housing systems. And what I mean by that is we wanted to take birds out of the conventional cages and put them in environments where they could perform more natural behaviors, be more active. In 2015, there was a research project that was concluded that was conducted at an industry scale, and it was evaluating 3 different housing systems. So the conventional cage, or how we have typically been producing our eggs, the enriched colony cage, which was a bigger enclosure, but it provided perches and some other things for the birds to be able to do to express more behaviors, and then cage-free aviaries. At the conclusion of that point in time, then, it became obvious that we were going to be moving to cage-free aviaries as the future for egg production in the United States. And so what happened then is, since then, we have seen this transition, and we have seen a commitment by both food service industries as well as state mandates that we need to start producing our eggs in cage-free environments, providing more access for those birds to express their natural behaviors, and both positive and negative behaviors that come with these cage-free environments.
Very good. So it seems like there was an extensive amount of research involved in this transition, and this is where we're at.
Yeah, exactly. And so now the bigger thing is trying to figure out if this is the way of the future. It is taking producers some transition to learn how to manage those birds in a new environment. We have to now deal with some health issues that we haven't seen in years past, same with behavior issues. And so now our research focus really has to be on how do we take the concerns that we're seeing in these types of environments and reduce or mitigate those for the producers so they can continue to have a very cheap protein source available for the consumer.
So, Darrin, when we look at this whole topic, is there really a connection to poultry welfare when we're transitioning to cage-free?
Yeah, so that is really, Sam, at this point, to be determined, right? We know that there are some very positive welfare outcomes for moving to cage-free environments for the birds. We also know, though, that we get some negative welfare outcomes as well. And so the downside is that while we have very quickly made a decision driven by the consumer and by the general public to produce cage-free eggs, we don't necessarily have all of the information in place to make sure we can mitigate those negative welfare outcomes. And so now there's a lot of emphasis in trying to make sure that we are truly doing what is in the best interest of those birds from a welfare perspective, and trying to reduce those negative behaviors and negative outcomes that were just unintended consequences that we didn't necessarily understand would be coming as we made this transition to cage-free housing.
Yeah, and when you talk about some of these natural behaviors and some of the consequences behind them, the first thing that comes to my mind is you have more birds interacting with each other. Are some of those like, say, pecking order kind of things? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, so when we look at it within the conventional cage, it wouldn't be uncommon to maybe have a group size of up to 15 or 20 birds. And what we understand is that those birds would form a hierarchy. Birds are very hierarchical, right? It doesn't
Yeah.
matter if it's just males or just females, it's everybody. And so with the laying hens, they would form this hierarchy, everybody knew their place. As we move to cage free, though, we have much larger group sizes. And when I talk about a large group size, it may be 5,000 birds. It could be, in some instances for producers, be an entire house. So maybe 70,000 birds. We don't understand as researchers, how do those birds interact with each other? Is there still a hierarchy? Is it more like, I'll go refer to the gangs of New York, where we just have all these little groups that are, trying to coexist. We don't have a good feeling. And so we do see some of these negative behaviors such as pecking or cannibalism, those things that we know are not enjoyable to talk about. And as consumers, they don't necessarily want to know about this, but it is something that is natural for chickens. And so now we're trying to figure out, okay, what do we need to do differently?
And it's definitely something that a lot of different groups in the animal kingdom see. I mean, for example, I used to raise African cichlids, which are a very aggressive type of freshwater fish. But
Mhm.
interestingly enough, in larger groups, their territorial dominance and aggression is tamed down. So it's interesting to kind of think about it in similarity to African cichlids to see what happens when there's even more birds. Does the pecking order calm, or is it, like you mentioned, is it like gangs of New York? Are they all fighting for dominance? You've got groups of chickens here and there, they're coming at each other. So no, it's a very interesting concept, a very interesting area of research. And something else that you had just mentioned is consumers' desire for cage-free eggs, which leads into my next question. What does the data tell us about consumer buying trends regarding cage-free versus the more inexpensive eggs coming from conventional housing systems?
Yeah, and that's where there's still a lot of research trying to understand the consumer buying habits. The one thing that I think is pretty much the general consensus is that while consumers may say, I very much want to have eggs that are produced by a cage-free facilities and I would be willing to buy them, when it comes down to that actual price point in the grocery store, if money is tight, you're going to likely buy the cheapest protein. And so that tends to be what we see. The other thing is we also know that your view as a consumer of cage-free versus conventional cages, it has to align with your beliefs and your morals and your values. And so we also have that pool. And as researchers, I would argue we really do not have a good understanding of how, if you say that these are your values and this is what you say you want to buy, do you not buy this or do you buy this, right? It's a big black box. We
Right.
understand the inputs are important, but how all those decisions are made, we really don't understand. And so what we're tending to see right now is ramping up the cage-free production to make sure that we can get to the point of meeting the demands for cage-free eggs that are in place by companies right now, food service, restaurants, things like that. However, we're not seeing the consumer stepping up to purchase those cage-free eggs. And so there's a disconnect, and it's very confounding right now for producers to try to decide, do I continue pushing towards cage-free production, or do I need to just wait here and really see what's going to happen, recognizing the amount of time and investment it's going to take to get those cage-free eggs to the consumer is going to be much further out than what they may desire. So it's a conundrum that I am not jealous that they have to weigh and face on a daily basis.
Yeah, not to mention there's also complication with different states requiring cage-free now, the push towards that.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And so even though I may be producing my eggs in Indiana, I may be selling eggs into the California market. And so as a producer, I need to meet whatever requirements California has set forth in order to get my eggs into that state. And that's the one thing I also don't know that consumers truly understand nor appreciate, that the way eggs move in the US, you may have your eggs tomorrow and they may have been coming from 1,000 miles away and they're within 24 hours of being laid. It's a very black box for them. And as an industry, we need to do a better job at telling our story of what we're doing to get those eggs to them at the end of the day.
All right, Darrin. So last question here, looking forward to the future, do you think there's too much emphasis on layer housing systems as opposed to not enough emphasis on the birds themselves? Could we be missing something by placing more focus on the bird's environment as opposed to focusing on the bird herself?
So I think at this point, Sam, it's an interesting question that you pose, right? Up to this time, we have spent a fair amount of emphasis from the welfare perspective of trying to do what we think is best for those hens. When you go out and you really start to look at our cage-free housing systems here in the US, there is no consistent type of cage-free housing used. Every producer may be using their own type. They may be making modifications for what they feel may be the best option for those laying hens. So I'm actually going to answer your question in two parts. One, I do think that we need to continue to focus on the hen, but I think we need to turn the question on its head and approach our housing design from what the hen needs, not what we think we need as the producer or as the worker in the house. What we may actually find is if we better understand how the hens visualize their environments or how they hear things in those houses or how they interact in these groups, we may need to completely redesign the housing system to allow them to better utilize that house that they have. And so I think it's one of those questions right now that we're kind of at why in the road, where we can continue to really kind of pursue the laying hen side of things, or we can pursue the housing. And I think we really need to spend a little more time on the housing side, but we need to make sure we're truly evaluating it from what the hen needs and how she may use that housing, not just our perception of things.
Yeah, no, and that's a great point. I mean, I think there's a lot of folks that think, the welfare side of things, and we talked about morals and your personal beliefs and stuff with how an animal should be treated when they're producing these eggs. And you think putting them in a cage sounds against welfare, or it doesn't sound like the best interest of the hen. But then you think about it, you're putting them in a large space with all these other birds, and that may not be in the best interest of the welfare of the bird either. So I totally get what you're saying with looking at the environment of these birds and looking at what is actually in the best interest of them.
Yep. And I think that's where, if we look out 25 or 30 years from now, I am of a strong belief that we will not be using what we are currently using as our production environments today for producing eggs in the future.
Oh, yeah.
And it's going to take some time to invest in both the research to get us there, and also an investment by those producers and the housing manufacturers to say, we need to do better. What are the tools that we can use to really make this environment different, still maintain that high level of productivity so we can produce the eggs that are needed by the consumers, but also make sure that we're trying to maximize the welfare for those birds in these types of environments.
Yeah, and I think that's a good takeaway, that the industry is doing everything they can to make sure there's welfare for the birds, they're taken care of properly, they're healthy, and all of that good stuff, and meet consumer needs.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Darrin, for joining me today to talk about this very interesting and ongoing, I could say, topic of research.
No problem, Sam. Thanks for the opportunity to talk with you today.